one on? No. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's afternoon. Perfect. I love when I'm right off the cuff like that. So I was asked to come here and talk to you all about the economy, which sounds kind of terrible. I have a colleague, a fellow economist, who has a little bit of an elderly mother, and she doesn't quite understand what an economist does still. And so she asked him, what do you do? And he didn't really want to talk about it, so he just told her, Mom, I make people sad. And so I am going to try to present a little bit of a more optimistic picture. We're going to talk about what's going on with the economy, not only locally, but of course, North Idaho is not what we call an autarky. Okay, so we're going to learn a lot of buzzwords today. Autarky, that's your first $1 million word. It means a self-contained, self-sufficient economy. Okay, North Idaho is not one. We're part of a broader American continental market, which is of course part of a global economy. So we're going to mix some topics from all sorts of different levels of analysis, and hopefully at the end of this half hour you will know everything that there ever is or will be to know about the economy. And that will be it. It's going to be clean, tight, and totally comprehensive. So, I'm going to kind of talk about this in two different portions. We're going to do a little bit about inflation, and we're going to do a little bit about labor. And these two things are very interconnected, and they're both tied to our demographic situation. So, first let's kind of think about broadly what's going on globally. What are some of the macro things happening? So there are two big stories that jump out. You have the pandemic, and you have a war between Russia and Ukraine. These are obviously two major developments that have had significant implications for our economy. But these two things have occurred at rather a coincidental point in time. Years and years ago, before we'd ever heard of COVID, before whoever it was ate that bat, or I don't actually know what happened, something happened in Wuhan. For any of that, before there was the special military operation in Ukraine, economists had the year 2022 circled. Why? 2022 is the year of peak baby boomer retirement. This is the year when 50% of the baby boomers are over the age of 65, and 50% are under the age of 65. So this is kind of the year that we begin to pass over the event horizon, and we are losing baby boomers at a rapid pace. Not physically, but out of the economy, right? Millions are retiring every year. And 2022 was always penciled in as the year of peak baby boomer retirement. So it's interesting that the pandemic and the disruptions in Eastern Europe happened in a year that was going to be demographically significant for us anyway. In addition, you had another major long-term trend going on, which was the move away from globalization. Okay, so big picture, for about 70 years after World War II, we had this nice globalized economy where anybody could buy any commodity they wanted from any other country, and it would be shipped to them. Nice, safe, clean. This was what we called the globalized economy. Well, we've been shifting away from that for quite some time. COVID has really pushed it over the edge because it has exposed the cost of relying on foreign supply chains. But actually, international trade as a percentage of the economy was in decline for about 8 years before COVID. You saw this happening with trade deals being revamped, America's sort of trading network beginning to narrow down. Fun fact, America is the least trade integrated industrial economy in the world. If you look at all the industrialized economies, America has the lowest share of its economy that is tied to foreign trade. Less than 10% of America's economy is based on trade, and about 40% of that is Canada and Mexico. So most of it, almost half of it is not even linked to overseas trade. So you've got these two big things that were already going on. A move away from globalization and the baby boomers entering retirement. These were going to have massive impacts on our economy anyway. And then you layer on top of that the pandemic and the conflict in Eastern Europe, and you get a lot of upheaval in the economy. So let's talk about that. Let's start by doing the inflation portion. So inflation has reached over 8% in recent months. The most recent CPI number was 8.3, before that it was 8.5. Basically what that means is if you just took a big sample of products off the shelf, on average the price is about 8% higher than it was in May of last year. I know it's June, we don't have June data yet. Remember, economists are weird, so we kind of speak in past months because we exist where our data exists and we don't have the June numbers yet. So you'll have to forgive that little idiosyncrasy. So we have the highest inflation that we've had since the 1970s, and it's certainly worth asking why. Well, it's at this point that I talk a lot of smack about my own profession. So economists love to create very intricate financial modeling. They love to create very advanced mathematical representations of the monetary system, the kind of things that you need to take continuous equations and differential equations to understand. But this is literally all to make ourselves feel better, okay? Because economists have what we call physics envy, which means we're jealous of physicists because physics is a real science and economics is not. So because we're jealous of the physicists, we have to do a lot of math to convince ourselves that we're doing real science. Okay, you don't need any of that to understand why we have inflation. We have inflation because we have a supply and demand asymmetry in the economy. So let's talk about supply and demand. Well, on a macroeconomic scale, what is demand? It's really just money. It's liquidity, the capacity of companies and households and the government to purchase things. That's what demand is when we're talking about the whole economy. And demand in America has expanded rapidly in recent years. We had those stimulus checks. Okay? The stimulus checks were really fun because economists have always talked about, and it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, we always had this concept that we called helicopter money. And the theory was, we would say, oh, well, if the economy was really stuck, you could just print cash and throw it out of a helicopter. And then people would pick it up and spend it, and then the economy would be fine. Right? Okay, but we were joking, but then they did it anyway. So that's what stimulus checks are, as helicopter money. It's not as cinematic as throwing money out of an actual helicopter, but it has the same effect from an accounting perspective. So you had stimulus checks, you had expanded unemployment insurance benefits, you had essentially free money, that's 0% interest rates for well over a decade at this point, and government budgets have been expanding. So all of that adds up to about $6 trillion more dollars in circulation in the economy than pre-pandemic. Now the reason this is particularly problematic is this occurred at the same time that we've had severe physical limitations on the economy's ability to produce products and deliver it to the consumer. So let's kind of think through this. At the very base of the supply chain, you have raw materials. There are severe shortages of raw materials right now. Lumber is the one that we're all the most familiar with because, you know, God help the man that his wife said she wanted a new flower bed in the backyard, so he went to buy some 2x4s and sorry. Okay, so we know what happened to the price of lumber, but it's not just lumber and it's actually not just fuel. It's pretty much anything you can think of and a lot of things that you probably don't think of unless How It's Made on the Discovery Channel is your favorite show, which I highly recommend. It's like the only rated G show left in America, so that's my favorite. So let's think about some of these raw materials. Steel, aluminum, these are big ones, but it's also a lot of very important industrial inputs, things like chromium and palladium. These are very expensive right now and they're in short supply. And this is partially because of how far-flung and interconnected global supply chains have become. And the situation in Eastern Europe has provided the perfect illustration of this. Okay, so anyone who's heard me talk recently is not allowed to raise their hand because that's cheating. You've heard that there's a shortage of semiconductors. And this is a big issue because most products that we want to buy are computerized at this point. It's not just your phone and your computer, it's also your car, your toaster, your thermostat, so on and so forth, okay? And a lot of industrial machinery too, right? It's all computerized, so we have a shortage of semiconductors. But who knows how a semiconductor is made? You don't usually think about this. It's made by etching a little silicone wafer with an industrial laser. And then they overlay those etchings with metal components, and that's how you make a semiconductor. Who knows how an industrial laser is made? Okay. It's not the apparatus from the old Goldfinger movie, right? It doesn't really look anything like that. Probably the best Bond movie, by the way, just my opinion. An industrial laser is made with something that we call processed neon gas. And 70% of the world's processed neon gas is manufactured in the city of Odessa, Ukraine. Okay, why? Well, neon can be made anywhere. It's extracted from the atmosphere. It's not that there's some unique raw material in Ukraine so we can only make it there. Any country in the world with the capital could make neon gas. The reason it's mostly made in Ukraine is because this is how we make things cheap. We make economies of scale. So you create an enormous neon plant in Ukraine, and it can make huge amounts of it. So you take advantage of that scale, that makes it cheap. That makes it cheap to make semiconductors, which makes it cheap to make computerized consumer products. We also take advantage of the fact that Ukraine has low wages, and the work in a neon plant is not particularly complex. It's not a super high value add industry. So this is how we've made things cheap for the consumer. But by concentrating and narrowing supply chains, you create a situation where naval mines and a Russian naval task force mean no cars on the lot. There's no gas, there's no semiconductors, there's no computers, there's no Honda, right? So this is the way globalized production has constructed our supply chains. They're very fragile because they're so narrow and interconnected. So we're having major raw material shortages, and this is making consumer products, the end product for the consumer, very expensive. We're also having severe difficulties with transportation. Now, be honest with me, before that ship went sideways in the Suez Canal, how many of you had ever actually spent much time thinking about cargo containers? We don't usually think about it. Some people who maybe work in shipping or warehousing will think about it, but for most of us, it's this sort of behind the scenes, beautiful system, ships rolling in, cargo containers, and then whatever I want to buy, I click, buy now, and 2 days later, there it is on my porch, right? So we depend on this perfectly streamlined, just-in-time shipping system, and it has been majorly disrupted by COVID, because this is a system that is not built to stop on a dime. Thousands of cargo containers that have to make many stops before the product can actually get to you. That's not something that you can just hit the brakes on, but we tried to do that anyway in 2020, and you end up with just a disastrous system where the material is in Kazakhstan. Oh, fun fact, a lot of the aluminum right now is just in sheets in warehouses in Kazakhstan because it's a lot of land there, so you just build a big warehouse, slap your aluminum there while you don't need it. So the aluminum's in Kazakhstan, and it's gotta get put on rail and taken to Shanghai. The port is closed in Shanghai, so the ship has to wait for the port to reopen to pick up the aluminum, to take it to Malaysia for fabrication into the next level of component. Then it's gotta wait for another ship, but while it was waiting, that ship went to Taiwan, had to come back, no semiconductors in Taiwan, so the components sit in Malaysia until they're semiconductors. Now the ship's in Africa, right? And on it goes, and you just end up with massive delays of materials and products reaching the consumer. So for the first time, a lot of Americans can afford to buy things that they can't physically procure. Right? We're used to going down to the lot, and the car you want is probably there in the make, model, and color, trim package, everything's exactly the way you wanted it, and it's so convenient that it's just sitting there waiting for you. Well, not right now. Right now, the parts to make the car are flung all around the world, and it takes a long time to get the transportation system to actually bring everything together, and then you actually have to get it to the dealership, and so on and so forth it goes. And it's really hard for us to solve the transportation issue because we don't have enough crane operators, we don't have enough longshoremen, we don't have enough truck drivers to actually get this system nice and greased up and moving properly. Fun fact, what occupation do you think had the most over-concentration of baby boomers? The most boomer-heavy occupation in the whole economy? What do you think it is? Trucking, very convenient, right? Everything is just kind of piling up at exactly the wrong time and at exactly the same time. So we have shortages of raw materials, and we have shortages of our transportation and infrastructure to move materials and products to the consumer. So why do we have inflation? $6 trillion extra dollars in consumption, and huge difficulties actually getting the product to the consumer. It's the same story with housing. Why are houses so expensive? There's not enough houses. This is supply and demand in operation, and again, I don't think you need any kind of sophisticated mathematical background to understand why this is the case. So, I have a math degree, by the way. I never use it, right? That was completely useless. That's just like a vanity thing. I haven't done a differential equation since I passed differential equations. So you don't actually need any of this to understand economics, okay? Supply and demand gets us all the explanatory mileage that we need. So that's the inflation side. Inflation is being driven by supply shortages and a lot of liquidity in the US economy. So I'll just briefly say, this is also why you've got such crazy valuations in the stock market throughout the pandemic, because the irony is that Q2 of 2020, so that's peak pandemic months. Unemployment is almost 20%, there's mass joblessness, nobody's out, nobody's on vacation, and yet that was the all-time high month for American disposable income. So it's this great irony because normally joblessness and income are not correlated. They actually tend to go the opposite direction. During the pandemic, you had a spike in income at the same time that the economy was idled. And so what people in my demographic, the 18 to 35 male demographic, this seems to be a problematic demographic. I don't know why. What we did was we got on stock trading apps and we gamified stocks. Yes. So that's why, GameStop shares went up like 800% in 2 days. That's why Nikola Motors was worth you probably never heard of it. Who's heard of Nikola Motors? A few people. Okay, well, they've never built a car. They don't even have a prototype. They were worth like $400 billion at one point in 2020 because they had a drawing of an electric truck, basically. People were like, oh, it's the next Tesla. I've got cash to burn, and they still haven't built a car. So this is our basic problem, right? Lots of liquidity sloshing around, trying to find things to do with itself. At the same time, you can't produce and deliver product to the consumer, so you get inflation. So that's the inflation portion of it. So now let's talk about labor. So we have a severe labor shortage in the state of Idaho, unfortunately. Right now, you have somewhere between 3 and 4 times as many open jobs as there are unemployed people in the state, which means even if everybody was employed today, just basic math, 3 out of 4 jobs cannot be filled. So the question obviously is, why is this the case? And unfortunately, this is a multifaceted problem, which means there's not one simple solution to it. The main issue is our demographic structure. But then there are other things like shortages of childcare, substance abuse, mental health issues that prevent us from maximizing our demographics. Right? The way we think about this is demographics determine the parameters of your economy. It determines a range of outcomes for you. And then these other things just determine whether or not you hit the maximum possible within that range. But demographics are the most important thing. So there's some good and some bad news here. The good news, well, I'll start with bad news. Bad news first, okay. The bad news is that America's demographics are not favorable for a growing economy. It's an aging country. The birth rate has been falling precipitously. That's a good word for you. That just popped out. I don't even know where I heard that. Precipitously, and it continues to fall. So we are in a position where our working age population is going to be stagnant for the foreseeable future. The birth rate is really the overriding determinant of where your economy is going to go, and America's birth rate has been pretty much at or below the replacement rate for a couple of decades now. So that's the bad news. The good news is that our demographics are somehow better than literally every other industrial economy in the world. So if you think that it's rough on the labor side here, it's much worse in Europe, Canada, China, Japan, South Korea, pretty much anywhere else you can think of. So fun fact, the Chinese have proved for all time that time progresses on a linear rate. And they did this because it turns out, proven now, when you adopt a one-child policy, 30 years later, you start to run out of 30-year-olds. So we like to think of China as a country that has bottomless labor, right, an infinite pool of human resources. That's definitely no longer the case. Chinese labor force has peaked for all time. It's in decline. They have a mass, and by mass I mean 400 million people in their late 50s, early 60s, and it will be declining. Japan is the oldest country in the world. South Korea is number 2. And Europe and Canada didn't have millennials. So you see, this was all leading up to trying to batter you all into being grateful for millennials. Okay. I've been scheming on this for years, and I finally figured it out. So Europe and Canada did not have a wave of births in the 80s and 90s like America did. So Europe has boomers like we do, but they don't have the millennial generation that's at least offsetting it. So frankly, America, despite our demographic difficulties, it's still better than any of our direct economic competitors. The sole exceptions would be France and New Zealand. And all love to the Kiwis, but there's just not that many of them. It's not a direct peer competitor. So apart from those two, every other industrial country is much older than we are, so that helps things. Now, within America, the essential issue is that we got cocky during the period roughly from 2008 to let's call it 16, okay? So in what sense? Well, that was a Goldilocks period where both millennials and baby boomers were working. We were very briefly double dipping on the generations, and so it actually created a brief spurt of good labor force growth. So the thing to remember about the millennials is that they're the children of the baby boomers by and large, which is why those intergenerational relationships are so interesting, because every millennial projects their own parents onto the boomers as a whole, and probably vice versa. That's just my little theory there. So the boomers and the millennials are a parent-child generation, and for a brief period there, both of them were in the labor force. So the boomers were in their late 50s, early 60s, millennials are getting into their 20s and going into work, so you have this brief Goldilocks period where you're double dipping, and it creates the illusion of labor force growth. But obviously that was not durable. Obviously the baby boomers were going to retire eventually, because no one is interested in my solution, which is just make retirement illegal. I have brought this up many times, and it's very strangely just a non-starter with most people. I can't figure out why. I know I'm not going to see, millennials don't care because we're totally cynical. We think we'll never get to retire anyway because Social Security will be gone and so on and so forth. So we're a jaded generation. It's very sad. So we had that Goldilocks period where we were double dipping. Now the boomers are retiring. Over half of them are retired, and we're losing a couple million a year. This tends to be traumatic for the economy because boomers are, like I said, they're concentrated in some specific occupations. Transportation is one. They're also more likely to be in managerial or supervisor roles. So when they retire, it creates sort of an institutional void in their company or organization. So we're losing the baby boomers, and we just don't have the numbers coming in to replace them. Now, you might be wondering, I've heard that the millennials are the largest generation in history. So how could we not have growth? Well, there's only so many millennials because there were so many baby boomers. The average baby boomer grew up in a household and they had 3 siblings. Okay, so 4 children on average per household. They then went on to, on average, have 2 children of their own. Okay, so the birth rate is slashed in half across the life of the baby boomers, and you do get a lot of millennials because there's a lot of parents, but it's not growth. It's basically demographic replacement. So we're in a stable state. So if you look at our labor force, it pretty much bears that out. It's stagnant. Thankfully, it's not shrinking. Again, in Europe, China, Japan, the labor force is shrinking, sometimes kind of shockingly. Again, it could be worse, right? That's about as optimistic as an economist gets. Right? Like, I know it's bad, but you should see South Korea. But we do have this demographic issue that we're facing, and we have to think about the fact that the birth rate seems to be dropping again, which is what is particularly startling. So you expect a drop in the birth rate when a country industrializes. You go from mostly a rural setting. Education is also lower, so the expense associated with a child is not as great. Suddenly, instead of a child being a short-term economic return, because they can help on the farm, right? Suddenly they're this long-term financial investment. So the logic flips, people live in a more enclosed space, and the birth rate drops. You expect that. That's happening in Mexico right now. In 1980, the average Mexican woman had 5 children. Today it's 2. Okay? So this is sort of an ironclad law. Anywhere that a country urbanizes, you get this halving of the birth rate. What we have been surprised by is that the birth rate seems to be dropping again. Millennials are the first generation where a majority say that they only want 1 child. Very few want more than 2. So we do have to think about what's going to happen to our economy 20 years down the line, essentially, because the children that are born today are the new workforce 20 years from now. And we can kind of look at countries like Japan or Germany and think that this might be what's happening to us. We might just be behind their experience. So we can't get cocky that we've been holding steady at 2, because there's always the potential for that further drop. And really the birth rate, yeah.
Is a takeaway